Hi there. It's tough to be at the end of the conference, but I hope I'll be able to entertain you for a couple of minutes. So my name is Slush. I run a company called CubeSensors. We build small, beautiful devices like this that measure everything about the indoors. But I'm not here about that. The reason why I'm here is because me and my colleagues have been running a hardware startup in Slovenia, in Europe, for the past almost 4 years, and we've been running it on a bootstrap budget, so almost zero. In the past couple of years, we've talked to a lot of investors, to a lot of partners, and all of them seem to have a lot of advice for startups. Though the main theme often is they usually have a very little idea how to evaluate hardware startups, and but even more frustratingly, they often just take the models they understand, so software companies, and copy them into the hardware world, which clearly does not work. So I wrote a guide for investors. It's called Investor's Guide for Hardware Startups, and it's online and available to anyone. I often get asked how it is to run a hardware company. And I think this sums it best. Building a hardware company is actually, or a hardware product, is as if you have if you're building a software, but you only have 4 compiles available, and every compile costs about 50,000 euros, dollars, pounds, whatever you like. So it's slow and long. This statement basically encompasses what is the key to my idea, is that iteration is totally different than in the software world. You cannot just change things every day, push it to the customers, and test it, what's going on, and then push it the next day to again. What you need to do, you have to diligently go through the whole process. So let me give you a couple of examples how software and hardware businesses compare. So this is a chart that talks about a software company. On the vertical, there are a number of companies, and on the horizontal line, there is time. The idea is that when ideas are spurting, when the companies are sketching their products, building their MVPs, there are a lot of them. But in software, what they can do, they usually can, within 2 months, they can launch a product. They see the feedback, then they start iterating, and only a few of them are successful, and then go scaling. In a hardware company, unfortunately, there's the same process. You start sketching, then you go prototyping, you go to Indiegogo, Kickstarter, crowdfunding, whatever you want, but then there is a long process of production, manufacturing, and everything else, and it's usually up to 12 months before you can actually deliver a product into the hands of your customers. So even just that makes hardware way more difficult than software, and this should reflect in evaluation, this should reflect in the capital requirements, and so forth. But to make this point even stronger, let's check what actually this hardware company has to go through. So the gray are the functions that the software company has to do in order to build a product or a company. The blue ones are on top of everything that, and this is all of the crap that basically hardware company needs to go through. And just to give you one sense of it, safety and compliance. When you build a product, you have to put it to authorities to evaluate it to get the certificates. This takes up to 2 months. This is usually longer than a software company can build a prototype and launch it. So this is yet another layer on the complexity of the hardware. But the interesting part comes when you start looking at the budget. This is a budget of a software company. So you have R&D, which takes up to 60% of your budget. You have the logistics, which are basically servers and that sort of stuff. And then you have something which I call margin, but basically in most of the software companies, you reinvest that. If you decide that you want to build a lifestyle company, you can take this money out, pay yourself a good salary, and live or work with it for a long time. But in hardware, there is some interesting dynamics. On top of the R&D, logistics, and margins, you have something that we call BOM, which is bill of material. Basically, you have to buy stuff that you put in your product, then you can then ship to your customers. This takes a lot of your budget. But the more interesting part starts when you start to distribute this. If you go to online retailers, they will usually take about 15 to 25% of the product's price. if you want to go to other distribution channels and to stores, everybody wants to ship their product through the Apple Store, there's another 30%. So the rule of thumb is that when you build a product and you want to use different distribution channels, they're going to take every degree of separation from your customer is going to take about 30% of your profits. So again, this is something that's completely different to a software. Yeah, but yet again, when you talk to investors, everybody comes and say, OK, so you should evaluate this in a crowdfunding campaign. Well, right. There are a couple of myths that I like to dispel here. Number one, everybody says you'll get validation. Well, it turns out that if you go to websites like Indiegogo or Kickstarters, you see that the successful hardware campaigns actually have somewhere between 200 and 2,000 backers, which is actually not that a lot. It's less than even an early adopters. On the other hand, when you are building a hardware company, a successful hardware company needs to ship somewhere around 100,000 units in order to go into scaling and growing. So actually, the validation on that side is not that strong. Another thing that they will often push you to is to the crowdfunding campaign is actually what they call amplification. It turns out that this used to be the case in the past, but nowadays is actually not anymore. In fact, I have some numbers which we've measured on our own. If you go to a newsletter of one of the big crowdfunding campaigns, out of 2 million recipients that go the newsletter to, you get roughly 1,000 visitors on a page bump. So this is not really a lot. Another thing that people often say is that crowdfunding campaigns are cost-effective. Well, it takes 4 to 6 months to prepare a proper crowdfunding campaign. It costs probably somewhere between 30 and 60,000 euros or dollars nowadays. Nowadays, it's almost the same of the cost of production to actually build the proper campaign. This is a long time in an early stage startup. It really, really defocuses you. And on the other hand, they say, yeah, you'll get initial capital. The recent numbers by Kickstarter is that the average successful hardware campaign yields roughly 80,000 US dollars. If you look at the margins out of that, you actually end up with a really small amount of money, particularly in comparison to the investment that you had to make. So crowdfunding nowadays can be one channel, can be one distribution channel, but is definitely not a validation for a successful investment. So you're going to say, so this guy just talks about how hardware is hard. Well, that's true, but there are a whole bunch of other advantages that most people actually forget. For example, in 2014, 3 out of 4 biggest exits were hardware. So Bits, Nest, and Oculus Rift. Another thing, which is something that most people forget, is that with hardware, you have a significant customer loyalty. Just think about it. If you have a computer, you usually have it up to 3 years. If you have a smartphone, you have it up to 2 years. If you go and pay for a service, for a subscription of something, you usually have it for a year. Then you might find something else. But with smart apps, it's even less. It's actually around 3 months. The beauty of hardware is that if you have a product, you have a physical thing that you give a customer that pay for it. And this is the customer loyalty that's unmatched in a software world. And the last point, which is really advantageous for a hardware company, is that barriers to entry, because of all of the points that I've mentioned earlier, are really high for your competitors. With that, you can actually, if you manage to launch, if you manage to have a decently successful product, your competitors struggle. That's why we love hardware. If you're interested in more in that, you can check the guide and the whole reasoning behind it online. And if you have any questions, please do shoot me an email. And thank you.